"Sir, this refund is denied. Leave the counter, now." That was the line that cracked the air inside the service center. The line that turned a quiet errand into a public showdown. The line that would push a clerk named Juana Vaughn into a moment she never saw coming. And pull Norman Payne into the kind of trouble he had learned to meet with silence. What Juana didn't know, not yet, was that this simple command would open a door she could never close again. What she didn't know was that her voice, loud and sharp, was about to drag every witness into a story with consequences far bigger than a denied refund. And if you've ever watched someone get singled out for no reason, you already feel where this is going. If you've ever seen a public humiliation start this fast, tell me in the comments. Let me take you back to how it unfolded. The Washington, D.C. service center buzzed under flickering lights, the kind that hum just loud enough to get on a person's nerves. Beige walls boxed in the long line of tired customers. Old posters with chipped corners hung behind the counters. People shifted in plastic chairs, flipping their tickets, waiting for their number to blink on the cracked screen above the printers. And then, Juana's voice cut through everything. She slammed Norman's receipt flat against the counter. Her finger pressed down until the paper bent, until the edges curled under her nail. Her heel clicked once, echoing through the space like a warning shot hitting metal. People felt it instantly. Heads turned. Phones lifted. Whispers rolled down the line like tiny waves hitting the shore. Norman stood at the counter, hands still, folder tucked under one arm. He didn't speak. He didn't step back. He didn't frown. But inside, something in him tightened, quietly, firmly. He scanned the room the way someone scans when they've lived through moments like this too many times. He noticed the security camera above the far station, pointed almost, but not exactly, at the counter. He caught the clerk 2 seats down pretending to reorganize pens. He heard someone near the door murmur, "Oh, this bout to get messy." And he felt all the attention shift toward him at once. Juana leaned closer, her shadow sliding across the counter. She didn't touch him. She didn't need to. Her voice carried the push. "You heard me," she said. "Move." The room dropped into a slow hush. The HVAC rattled to a stop. A printer paused mid-page. Someone in the waiting area whispered, "He better watch it," and another answered with a soft, knowing sigh. Behind Juana, "The policy rules must be followed" poster glowed under a flicker of the light. She stood in front of it like it was a badge she thought could protect her. Norman stayed steady. He looked at her hand pressing the receipt like she wanted to push him through the floor. He looked at the customers forming a half circle around him. He caught the reflection of a raised phone in the window to his left. He took a breath, slow, controlled. He had seen moments like this. Felt them. Lived them. This wasn't new. But it was dangerous. If this already hits too close to home, hit like so more people see it. Juana realized eyes were on her now. Lots of them. Phones too. So she raised her chin and spoke even louder. "This form isn't acceptable. You can't complete this request here." Her tone carried weight, but not the weight of rules. It carried the weight of power used too fast. Too hard. Too public. Norman watched her finger press into the receipt again. He didn't react. He didn't break. He simply took note, like he always did. A woman near the water cooler whispered, "He's too calm. That's the type who've been through this before." Another shook his head. "Nah. That's the type who knows something." Juana looked irritated now, caught between authority and fear of being recorded. She tried to stand taller. She tried to reclaim the moment. But something shifted across the room. A quiet awareness. A tightening tension. A feeling that something important was about to happen. Norman took one more slow breath. Then he finally spoke. "I'm not leaving." Simple words. Soft words. But they hit the room like a dropped weight. A man in the corner whispered, "Nah. Record all of this." A chair squeaked as someone stood for a better view. Juana froze. For the first time, doubt crept into her face. She looked toward the other clerk, no help. She glanced at the poster behind her, its glow suddenly felt empty. Norman didn't blink. He didn't shake. He didn't fold. He stayed as steady as stone. Something about his stillness scared her. Something about his voice worried her. Because the truth was simple. No one knew who Norman Payne might call next. Not the clerk. Not the customers. Not even Juana. All they knew was that he reached into his pocket. Slowly. Carefully. And lifted his phone. That was the moment the real story began. Subscribe if you want to see what happens the moment he dials, and share this if you've ever seen someone treated like this for no reason. You still don't get it, sir. Juana Vaughn stepped closer. Not touching, but close enough that the space around Norman felt smaller. Her heels clicked against the tile in short, sharp bursts. Every step a warning. She leaned slightly, just enough to push her presence into his, letting the room know who she thought controlled this space. Norman didn't move back. He didn't flinch. His hand stayed over the folder, calm and steady. But inside, his mind was working fast. He noticed everything. The tilt of Juana's head. The way her fingers traced the edge of the receipt. How she misread the form number and flipped the page backward. A mistake. Tiny. But a crack in her armor. If you've ever been cornered by someone who thinks rules are on their side, leave a comment. What would you do? Hal Weiss, the security officer standing nearby, shifted slightly. Just enough to make it clear he supported Juana without saying a word. His posture, subtle nods, the faint tightening of his jaw, it all whispered the same thing: this system was stacked. Every signal confirmed the weight of authority against Norman. Norman's eyes flicked to Hal. Calm. Measured. Taking mental notes. Every step, every pause, every glance counted. He marked the order of interventions, the timing of distractions, and which staff members noticed him versus which didn't. Micro opportunities stacked in his favor like invisible chess pieces. The patrons noticed, too. Small reactions, an eyebrow raising here, a shoulder shrug there. Some nudged their phones just slightly, capturing what they could without drawing attention. DC had its own language, subtle and fast. Norman read it all. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Juana said, her voice clipped and precise. She pointed at the folder with a finger, tapping once for emphasis. The sound cut through the buzz of fluorescent lights, the low hum of conversations, the soft shuffling of papers. Norman leaned slightly forward, not aggressively, just to glance at the page Juana had misread. Another tiny error. Another opening. "Notice how calm he stays while the room holds its breath," a bystander whispered, almost to themselves. "If you see someone being underestimated like this, hit like, because staying silent lets unfairness grow." Juana's lips pressed tighter. She straightened her shoulders, making her frame larger, trying to fill the space with authority. The manager and supervisor signs above the counter seemed to glow brighter, as if lending weight to her claim. Every staff member in uniform became part of the performance, each one adding pressure without a word. Norman's eyes moved fast, scanning every face. The clerk adjusting envelopes at the far end. The customer leaning lightly against the counter. Even the way the AC vent shifted the papers across the desk. Microtells. Each subtle movement told a story. "This is how quiet strategy wins," murmured a man near the front, phone tucked under his arm. Norman traced the edges of the receipt again. Not touching it. Not reacting to Juana's hostility. Just observing. Every fold, every ink mark, every misstep Juana made recorded in his mind. Juana's voice rose just slightly. "You're wasting my time. Move it along." Her tone had the kind of sharpness that could make someone snap. But Norman stayed still, every breath deliberate. every inch of calm a counterweight to a rising tension. The security guard shifted again, subtly blocking the path Norman could have used to leave. It was small, nearly invisible, but Norman noticed. Every person, every angle, every authority figure weighed against him. Yet he didn't act rashly. He calculated. Have you ever felt all eyes on you, judging, assuming, waiting? Share your story below. Across the counter, the policy enforcement sign flickered in the light, as if reminding Norman of the rules Juana hid behind. But he didn't read it as a threat. He read it as context. As a stage. As part of the chessboard where small errors became leverage. Juana's gestures became sharper. One hand pressed flat on the counter. The other tapped impatiently against the folder. Each motion precise. Controlled. Deliberate. She wanted to intimidate, to puncture his calm. But Norman's presence held the room steady. Customers shifted uneasily. Phones moved, capturing the tension in silent protest. Eyes darted between Norman and Juana. Some whispered quietly. Some stayed still, recording with a trembling hand. Norman's mind ran like a clock. Seconds, movements, angles, lighting, everything measured. Every small oversight Juana made became a mental marker. Every staff pause, every glance at a policy sheet, every half smile or tight lip registered. If you've watched authority try to crush dignity, comment now, how you would stand? Then Norman's eyes met Juana's directly. Not threatening. Not pleading. Calm. He let the silence stretch. He let the room feel the weight of it. Juana blinked. A tiny hesitation. A crack in her armor. It lasted only a second, but enough for Norman to know she sensed his control, even if she couldn't name it. A young clerk muttered under her breath, "He's not scared. He knows something we don't." If you want to see how a quiet mind can outmaneuver a system, hit subscribe, because the story isn't over yet. Norman's lips pressed together, breathing steady, posture neutral. But his mind counted, mapped, and prepared. Every error Juana made, every slack in staff attention, every flicker of distraction became a tool. The room held its breath. Juana's authority faltered. Just a fraction. Norman didn't move. He didn't speak. He didn't react. And in that pause, everyone realized, he was not playing by the visible rules. The crowd leaned closer, phones pointed. Whispers spread. The tension thickened. Because no one in that service center knew which move Norman Payne would make next. And that suspense alone held the space still, frozen, ready. He stepped back into the corner, just enough to be unseen, but not enough to be forgotten. Norman Payne moved quietly to the side, sliding behind a low partition near the service counter. His hands rested lightly on the clipboard, fingers tapping against the polished surface, eyes still scanning every face, every movement. If you've ever stayed silent while someone else was cornered, pause and think about why. On the lanyard around his neck, small medallions glinted, a history of community service, first aid training, youth mentorship. Each one told a story, a reminder that he had survived scrutiny before, that he knew how to read the tiny tells of authority figures. A folder labeled policy references sat open beside him, organized, precise. A pen rested diagonally across the top page, a quiet signal of control. He remembered the D.C. Community Center where he had spent his afternoons as a boy. Rows of folding chairs, echoing gym walls, the smell of floor polish and cafeteria lunches. Mentors had taught him to watch the person in charge, notice the shift of weight, the tightening of the jaw, the subtle glance at a clock. They had taught him that authority could be human or cruel, and the only protection was calm, observation, and patience. If you've ever seen someone judged unfairly, comment below, your voice matters more than you think. A flash of memory hit him, a youth basketball game, a referee pointing at him, questioning his honesty. Norman had stayed still, letting the moment pass, noting how the crowd reacted, how friends whispered encouragement, how adults measured his every move. That same instinct now guided him, mapping the service center in milliseconds, noting who would intervene first, and who would hesitate. The folder opened with a quiet snap. Norman flipped to the section on form numbers, his eyes catching a subtle misread from Juana earlier, page backward, ink smudged. Opportunity. Not a mistake. Strategy. Each micro-error was a breadcrumb to leverage. His hands adjusted the clipboard slightly, tilting it just enough to signal readiness without inviting confrontation. Patrons glanced in his direction, some whispering, some raising phones just a fraction. If this scene already makes your stomach knot, like and share, because staying silent is part of the problem. He traced each face, noting small gestures. One clerk had a slight shrug, hiding behind procedure, another tapped a laminated sheet almost absent-mindedly. Security Officer Hal Weiss remained close to Juana, leaning just enough to affirm her stance, but Norman read it as human hesitation, not absolute power. The medallions shifted slightly against his chest as he leaned, not forward, not back, an invisible signal to himself that control was within reach. Childhood lessons had taught him that gestures, however small, often dictated the flow of public scrutiny. A tilted folder, a lowered pen, a steady gaze, they could be shields. Norman's mind flickered through other moments. Community service projects, coordinating youth cleanups, organizing local drives. Each encounter had taught him to measure authority against patience, to notice the unspoken hierarchy, to act decisively when timing aligned. This was not instinct, this was learned, practiced, honed. Comment if you've ever noticed injustice unfold in front of you but weren't sure how to respond. Your voice counts. The air in the corner felt thick, but controlled. Fluorescent lights buzzed above, flickering just enough to illuminate his organized workspace, clipboard angled for efficiency, pen poised, medallions gleaming faintly under the harsh glow. Norman exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of anticipation and preparation. He reviewed the strategic layout silently. Where could Juana move next? Which patron might step forward? Which staff member would falter under pressure? Each movement, each glance, each murmur was data. Norman had never been one to overreact. He didn't need to. Every memory, every medal, every carefully pinned piece of paper had trained him to act with precision. Authority and bias could be measured, dissected, and neutralized without losing composure. He adjusted the folder again, a slight tilt this time, marking a page with the pen he held loosely. The action was tiny, but purposeful. The gesture communicated focus, readiness, and calm. If you're watching this and feel powerless, tag someone who needs to see how patience and strategy can shift the balance. For a brief moment, the past and present merged. Norman saw himself as the boy at the community center, then as the man standing in this DC service center. Every lesson, every minor victory, every glance of understanding now converged into one principle: observation first, action second. He counted the exits again, noted the reflection in the glass door, tracked the slight micro-expressions of staff and patrons. Each detail folded into a larger plan. The moment was quiet, almost imperceptible, but charged with potential. The corner became his command post, not a hiding spot. Every micro-movement of his hands, every adjustment of the clipboard, every calculated pause was a signal of control. Juana might think she had dominance, but Norman had history, observation, and a mind tuned to subtle cues. Subscribe now to follow how one man's calm in public pressure unfolds, and see why small actions matter more than they seem. Norman's gaze lingered on the room. Phones were raised, whispers exchanged, and eyes measured reactions. He didn't need to act yet, he only needed to record, catalog, and prepare. Strategy was silent, invisible, and unstoppable. The corner, the medallions, the clipboard, they weren't props. They were tools. Each represented mastery over micro-behaviors, authority testing, and public pressure. Every tilt of the folder, every pen adjustment, every micro-breath signal he was ready. And with that readiness, Norman waited. Because when the moment to move finally arrived, every lesson, every medal, every quiet action in the corner would matter more than anyone in that service center could imagine. If this moment already makes you wonder what you would do, share your thoughts in the comments, Silence lets bias win. Norman Payne didn't move. He simply watched. The fluorescent lights hummed above, flickering like the quiet drum of a city that never fully sleeps. His eyes, calm and measured, tracked each motion at the counter, the way Juana's fingers drummed against the edge of the desk, the slight tilt of her head when she read a number incorrectly, the exaggerated snap of a stapler she didn't need. If you've ever felt invisible while someone shouted at you, type yes in the comments. Your voice matters. Juana Vaughn, flushed with authority, began rejecting every form Norman placed before her. Each denial came with a clipped statement, a word that carried more weight than the policy itself. This isn't acceptable. I can't process this. You're out of order. Her tone assumed supremacy, yet with every false citation of procedure, she inadvertently revealed her ignorance. Norman's hands never wavered. He adjusted one folder, nudged a pen closer to a clerk, slid a receipt back into exact alignment, small, deliberate movements that communicated control without words. He noted which staff glanced at him with suspicion, which murmured Juana's phrases in soft repetition, and who whispered under their breath. Nothing escaped his attention. The patrons began to notice. Phones rose, slightly, almost timidly at first. Then with certainty, each small device capturing the unfolding public scene. A man in the mid-row whispered, "She's wildin' now," while another responded, "Yeah. But he ain't flinching." Norman caught the murmurs in his peripheral vision, the way a conductor might hear a faint offbeat in an orchestra and adjust the tempo without stopping the music. Juana's chest puffed out. Her confidence radiated, but it was the confidence of someone who believed she controlled the narrative. She didn't see the subtle cracks forming around her authority, the papers that were now perfectly aligned in Norman's folder, the clerk whose fingers hovered uncertainly over a laminated guide sheet, the patrons whose cameras were now pointed deliberately at the counter. If you're watching this and have ever seen someone gaslighted in public, share your story below. Don't let silence win. Norman's mind worked in microbeats. He counted steps, timed pauses, and mapped attention lapses like chess pieces on a board. Every tilt of Juana's head, every misquoted rule, every overemphasized flourish was stored, analyzed, and catalogued for later leverage. He wasn't performing calm. He was operational. Each micro-movement was strategic, each gesture purposeful, each breath an invisible tool in a game no one else understood. A clerk at the side window shifted, almost imperceptibly, and Norman's eyes caught it. He rotated the forms by a single degree, nudged a pen just enough to indicate the next step, and waited. Juana, meanwhile, continued her theatrical displays, slamming another form down, flipping pages backward as if correcting an imaginary error. To anyone else, it looked like chaos. To Norman, it was method in motion. The patrons whispered. Cameras adjusted. A woman near the door tilted her phone toward the counter, careful not to be noticed. A young man laughed under his breath, shaking his head. Man, she's wild, and he just sits there. Norman didn't respond, didn't smile. But he allowed the observation to be absorbed, every small act of public scrutiny strengthening the balance of power quietly shifting in his favor. Juana leaned closer to Norman, voice rising slightly. Sir, this procedure is clear. You can't submit this form like this. Do you understand? Norman looked at her. Not angrily. Not defensively. Calmly. Then, as if deciding she needed a lesson in precision, he adjusted the order of the documents, flipped the page with measured care, and nudged the counter pen toward the clerk. Each motion was slight, imperceptible to most, yet each gesture amplified the tiny cracks in Juana's command. If this tension is making your heart race, pause and comment, how would you react in his place? A flash of uncertainty crossed Juana's face. No one noticed but Norman. She believed the crowd, the procedures, the hierarchy were fully on her side. She didn't see how the forms now aligned, how the clerk's hesitation grew, how the patron's focus had quietly shifted from her authority to Norman's calm assurance. The room felt heavier. Conversations were quieter. Phones moved faster. The flickering fluorescent lights above emphasized Norman's stillness, casting alternating shadows across the counters and on the glinting medallions on his lanyard. Every small metallic reflection seemed deliberate, like markers in a visual code only he could read. Juana's voice rose again, sharper now, trying to reclaim dominance. These forms are not compliant. I can't. She stopped. Her eyes flicked to the clerk beside her. The clerk hesitated, the laminated guide sheet frozen midair. Then the clerk looked at Norman, uncertain. He didn't move. He simply met the gaze. Norman's calm was louder than any shout. Each patron in the room felt it. Each phone recording the moment sensed it. The subtle micro-actions of organizing forms, adjusting pens, scanning reactions, these invisible movements carried authority, not performative drama. A man whispered, "He's not even speaking. And we're waiting on his move." Another added, "I ain't never seen anyone so quiet and still. This is something else." Norman noted it all, his brain cataloging, strategizing, preparing for the eventual pivot. If this kind of quiet resistance surprises you, hit like, acknowledge the power in composure. Juana, frustrated now, slammed the final form on the counter. She stepped back, arms crossed, thinking she had created a visual statement of control. The patrons didn't shift toward her. They weren't cheering her. They were watching Norman, waiting for the response that would, unknowingly to her, change the game. Norman exhaled slowly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He didn't betray irritation. Every small gesture, the pen nudged, the forms aligned, the tilt of his head, communicated one thing clearly: he was aware. He was present. He was strategically mapping every angle. The subtle sounds of the environment, printer whirs, murmured phrases, the scrape of chairs, became a background symphony to the micro-ballet of tension at the counter. Every movement, small or nearly invisible, added to the mounting social stakes. Juana began repeating herself, her tone a shade sharper, almost losing patience. But the very act of repetition highlighted her mistakes, misread numbers, inverted procedures, procedural rules cited incorrectly. Norman's steady gaze caught each error. Each was an opportunity, silent but potent. A clerk adjusted a lanyard, uncertain whether to intervene. Norman's eyes flicked briefly, noting hesitation, noting opportunity. He allowed the pause to linger, the weight of observation falling on Juana. If you're witnessing injustice quietly unfold, type share, don't let it pass unnoticed. Norman finally moved, just a slight shift to his right, arranging forms in precise order, aligning them with the counter edge. His movements were almost imperceptible, yet deliberate, an unspoken message to everyone present that control did not require noise. The room sensed it. Patrons leaned forward in their seats, eyes narrowed, cameras locked. Juana noticed the change in energy but couldn't define it. Her authority felt under siege, but not by shouting or heroics. It was undermined by visibility, procedure, and the calm of a man who had been underestimated for too long. A customer whispered, "He ain't even speaking, and she's already cracking." Another murmured, "Yeah. This is about to flip in his favor." Norman's breath remained steady. His eyes swept the room again, left to right, noting the smallest gestures, where attention flagged, where curiosity lingered, and which patrons now subtly leaned in. Every micro-move, every reflection, every shadow of authority was recorded internally, forming the blueprint for the next step. The tension was palpable. The fluorescent lights flickered once more. Phones rose higher. The clerk's hand trembled slightly as she reached for a form. Juana's lips tightened. The room collectively inhaled. Norman, still calm, made a subtle nod toward a nearby staff member. Not a command. Not a request. Just a recognition that everything in the room, the missteps, the micro-actions, the public scrutiny, was now part of the silent power play he controlled. Subscribe if you want to see how quiet strategy can overturn loud authority. And in that pause, in that stillness filled with intent, the true lesson of the encounter began to unfold. Authority, Juana's supposed supremacy, was being quietly dismantled by observation, composure, and faceless calculation. Every minor error, every flinch, every misread form fed into a growing tension that no one yet knew would snap, but everyone felt the weight of it. Norman's micro moves weren't dramatic. They weren't performative. But they were potent. And they were being recorded, mentally and digitally, by a room now completely absorbed in the slow unraveling of a public display of arrogance. If you've ever been underestimated in public, comment now, let people see the power of composure. And as the fluorescent lights flickered one final time before steadying, everyone in the service center realized that the next move Norman made wouldn't just solve a paperwork problem, it would shift the balance of power entirely. Norman slid into the quiet corner, eyes scanning the posted rules like a general surveying a battlefield no one else could see. Norman moved deliberately, almost imperceptibly, to the far side corner of the service counter. It was quiet there. A small pocket of distance kept him from Juana's ever-watchful gaze. The fluorescent hum above was louder here, echoing faintly against beige walls, but it was the only sound he needed. Every eye in the store still wandered, some on phones, some on the unfolding spectacle, but none noticed him here, preparing. He crouched slightly, leaning over his clipboard. Papers were neat, ordered just so. Form numbers aligned. Notes on past approvals stacked beside a small tablet, every digital screenshot placed for easy retrieval. This was not desperation. This was strategy. Faceless, quiet, invisible, power in preparation, not performance. A clerk, Lindsay Hurst, approached subtly from the side. Her uniform crisp, badge glinting under the flickering lights. She didn't speak. Didn't even look Norman directly in the eyes. Instead, she slid a small tablet across the counter. It held digital copies of prior approvals, timestamps, and signatures. Norman's fingers barely grazed it as he absorbed the information. If you've ever had help that no one else noticed, leave a comment telling me about it. He didn't speak. He didn't nod. His eyes simply lifted to scan the room again. Juana continued to dominate the main counter, slamming forms, citing obscure procedural rules with the confidence of someone who had convinced themselves of authority. But Norman saw the cracks. The misread form number she ignored, the page flipped backwards, the momentary hesitation when she sought the nod of Officer Hal Weiss, all quietly logged in his mind. Each staff member, each patron, each surveillance camera in the corner became part of a mental map. Angles noted. Distance measured. Lines of sight calculated. Norman was not preparing a spectacle, he was building invisible leverage. The policy enforcement signs hung in perfect alignment above multiple counters. Norman's eyes darted to one, then another. He read the wording slowly, comparing it to what Juana had cited. Small contradictions emerged. Opportunities. Each tiny procedural misstep she believed was invisible became a tool in his mental arsenal. He made no noise, but the store seemed to bend around his awareness, each hum of air conditioning, each flicker of fluorescent light punctuating his silent calculations. Pause for a second, think about how often small details save you when others are blind to them. Comment if you've seen someone quietly outsmart an unfair situation. Norman's hand rested briefly on a medallion pinned to his lanyard, a symbol of community service from DC centers he had attended as a boy. Another clip to the same chain was a first aid certification card, both reminders of competence built in real-world situations, far removed from store counters or staff hostility. He adjusted his clipboard, tilting it to align the pen just so, each movement deliberate. The room continued its theater of tension. Patrons whispered, shoulders shrugged, phones tilted to capture more than anyone knew. Juana, at center stage, did not notice the quiet orchestration in the corner. He glanced at the digital tablet Lindsay had provided. Timestamps aligned with earlier approvals. Notes from previous clerks were highlighted. It was proof, but not flaunted, silent power ready to speak only when he needed it to. Norman's eyes flicked briefly to Officer Hal Weiss, standing in the back with a posture that suggested complicity, the kind of subtle bias that nobody admitted but everyone knew. Norman factored him into the timing of his counterstrike. Every micro-action counted. Flipping a page just slightly, nudging a pen closer to a clerk, keeping one hand relaxed while the other organized digital evidence. Observers saw calm. Not heroics. Not a man trying to prove himself. A professional quietly applying decades of experience in situational awareness and procedural mastery. If you're watching and thinking, could you stay calm in this situation? Hit like and reflect, because composure can speak louder than shouting. Norman's eyes swept again, left to right, catching every body, every reflective surface, every minor shadow shift. Patrons were leaning slightly forward, whispers crossing mid-distance. He noted who could see him from the back, which phone cameras angled toward him, and who was distracted by Juana's false confidence. Timing was everything. He adjusted the folder again, aligning the edge with the counter's metallic line, a silent signal that precision mattered. He placed the pen exactly where a clerk might need it next. Small movements, barely perceptible, yet each choreographed to maintain control of what could easily become chaos. Juana slammed a set of forms down, voice sharp, accusing. Norman didn't react. Not even an eye twitch. But he had noted the slight misalignment of her papers, the backward page flip, and the momentary pause when she expected the clerk to echo her authority. Each of these tiny errors became invisible leverage. Think about how small actions in the background can change a whole story. Tag someone who quietly handles pressure like this. He paused briefly, inhaling calmly, feeling the air in the corner, the hum of fluorescent lights, the barely perceptible shift of patrons' attention toward subtle motions. Lindsay Hurst had returned to the side, hands folded, eyes alert but unassuming. Her support was quiet, but it mattered. The digital proof on the tablet glowed softly in Norman's hand. He scrolled slowly, thumb hovering over the next set of documents, calculating when and how to present them. Timing would determine the reaction. Not volume. Not anger. Not authority performed for show. Just clean, faceless, undeniable competence. Norman's mind replayed lessons from DC community centers. Childhood evenings spent observing adults, watching patterns, learning the micro-behaviors of authority figures. Reading their pauses, their glances, their small inconsistencies. Learning that control was not loud, but deliberate. That humiliation could be turned into leverage by noticing what others ignored. Every medallion, every folded certificate, every highlighted document whispered experience and competence. Norman's hand lingered on a community service pen, then a policy reference folder. The world outside this corner disappeared. There was only observation. Calculation. Preparation. If you've ever felt overlooked but quietly prepared, share this story, because preparation is a silent superpower. He finally looked up, scanning Juana's main counter from the corner. She barked instructions, cited rules, and gestured aggressively. Patrons recorded some, whispered to others, some shook their heads. But Norman saw beyond the noise, timing gaps, distracted clerks, half-remembered policies, all invisible cracks in her performance. He adjusted the digital proof slightly toward the edge of the counter. Not a display. Not a threat. Just an opportunity for a future move. His eyes caught the angle of a surveillance camera in the back corner. Its lens tracked him automatically, but he accounted for the reflection off the polished floor, the glass behind Juana. Every detail would matter once the counter-strike began. Norman's lips pressed briefly together, then released a controlled breath. Not a sigh. Not frustration. Just focus. Each inhale measured. Each exhale calculated. A room of people watched, none realizing the quiet storm in the corner. Take a moment to think, how often do we ignore preparation and notice only spectacle? Comment if you've been in Norman's shoes. His final micro-action in the corner was slight but deliberate. He rotated the clipboard to align perfectly with the edge of the counter, nudged the pen again toward where it could serve as proof, and tilted the tablet so Lindsay's contribution could be retrieved at a moment's notice. Every observer would see calm. Nobody would see strategy. The ambient sound, the fluorescent flicker, the low hum of the air system, the subtle shuffle of a patron's sneaker, filled the gap. Norman remained still. Every micro move placed, every observer silently noted. Faceless. Controlled. Invisible. Strategic. Then he looked up, letting his eyes meet a few patrons' gaze briefly. Not a smile. Not a glare. Just acknowledgement. And the room felt a subtle tension shift, a recognition that something unseen was about to change everything. Norman returned his attention to the rules posted on the wall, comparing, noting, integrating. He prepared silently for the moment he would leverage every unseen detail, every overlooked procedure, and every quiet ally. Juana remained oblivious, barking orders, confident, unaware that her own missteps were stacking against her. If you want to see how invisible preparation turns the tide, subscribe and watch closely. These moments make all the difference. By the time Norman finally stepped away from the corner, his clipboard, proofs, and silent observations aligned, he had already set the stage for the counterstrike. The patrons would notice later. The staff would notice later. Juana would notice last. And when it happened, it would feel sudden, but it had been carefully orchestrated in the quiet corner all along. Norman's calm authority, faceless competence, and invisible strategy had created leverage no loud words could match. And for anyone watching, the lesson was clear: quiet preparation, attention to micro details, and strategic observation can shift a room, even when no one thinks you have power. Juana froze, her eyes flicking between the posted rules and the approvals on Norman's tablet, as the room started to sense the shift she hadn't expected. Juana's voice had carried authority for almost an hour. Each word she spoke cut through the air like a knife, sharp, demanding, precise. But now, she hesitated. Her hands hovered near the counter, finger twitching slightly as her gaze darted to the tablet Norman had placed neatly before her. The screen glowed softly, displaying the prior approvals, neatly documented, each line in crisp black text. The posted rules on the wall seemed to echo back to her, as if the universe itself had drawn a line she couldn't cross. Norman remained calm. Hands folded over the folder, thumbs lightly touching, posture relaxed but precise. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't step forward. He simply let the evidence speak. Every micro-movement, every controlled glance was a silent message, strategy in action, faceless but firm. The patrons around the service counter shifted in their seats. Some raised phones, subtle but deliberate, capturing the moment. Others leaned forward just slightly, whispering under their breath. "Did she see that?" One murmured. Another shook their head. "She's overreaching." Eyes flicked toward the screens above, then back to Norman, scanning his calm presence. If you've ever felt powerless watching someone get cornered, pause and leave a comment. You're part of this story too. A clerk, Lindsay Hurst, quietly slid a tablet across the counter toward Norman. No words, just a nod. The gesture was small, but in a room so tense, it spoke volumes. Norman's eyes registered the move and shifted slightly to capture the angle of every camera above, the spacing between clerks, the subtle body language of each staff member. He placed the tablet next to the folder, aligning it perfectly with the edges, opening a new sheet of documented approvals. The act was almost ritualistic, precise, intentional, faceless strategy in motion. Juana's confidence faltered. She opened her mouth, closed it again. Her authority, once sharp and commanding, began to feel uncertain, like a microphone suddenly losing signal. The patrons noticed. A ripple of subtle recognition passed through the waiting room. People leaned in slightly, not to glorify Norman, but because something in the energy of the room had changed. The invisible balance of power shifted. Norman's eyes tracked every motion. The doors as patrons entered, the nods from clerks, the small smiles of acknowledgement. Micro gestures that had once been invisible now registered as evidence of the unfolding truth. Each movement was authentic, human, and quiet. No one was performing heroics. No one was dramatizing the moment. Everything was faceless, real, consequential. Juana picked up one of Norman's forms, flipping it carefully, misreading a number before she corrected herself. Norman didn't flinch. He noted it, a small error, insignificant to most, but in his mind, a strategic foothold. He shifted the folder slightly, nudging a pen toward the counter, just enough for a clerk to see and note the correct placement. Every move was subtle, yet precise. Every action layered. The room was silent enough to hear a pen click against paper. A customer's shoe squeaked on the tile. A phone vibrated on a nearby bench. But through it all, attention focused on the counter. Not on any one person's anger or triumph, but on the unfolding pattern, an invisible choreography Norman conducted without ever stepping into the spotlight. A young man near the back of the room whispered, "She's losing it." Another added, "Nah. She didn't see this coming." Their voices were low, careful not to intrude, yet they carried the weight of the room's perception. The tension wasn't about Norman being a hero. It was about competence, preparation, and the quiet unraveling of unjust authority. Norman reached for another folder. He pulled out a printed form, aligning it carefully beside the others. His fingers hovered for a moment, adjusting the corner just so. The light from the fluorescent above glinted on his watch, then the medallions pinned to his lanyard, casting soft reflections onto the counter. Every small object, folder, pen, tablet, medallions, served as a marker of skill, discipline, and prior preparation. Juana exhaled sharply. Her lips parted, words threatening, but she paused, caught by the meticulous order before her. The room noticed. Patrons' whispers shifted tone. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others raised eyebrows. Nothing was loud. Nothing was dramatized. Just subtle acknowledgement that the rules, the procedure, and the evidence were quietly in Norman's favor. If this moment makes you rethink how power works in public spaces, leave a comment below. Tag someone who should see this too. Norman didn't speak. He didn't react visibly. Yet his eyes swept the room again, tracking who was engaged, who was recording, who had drifted in attention. The micro-observations layered, recorded silently, like a chessboard with invisible pieces. Every clerk, every patron, every inch of counter space contributed to the unfolding dynamics. Juana finally spoke, voice tight, clipped, almost mechanical. These forms aren't valid." She pointed at one paper, then another, flipping through pages. But her gestures were slower now. Less confident. Less certain. And the room could sense it. Norman moved just slightly, hands adjusting the folder, aligning the edges perfectly with the tablet. Nothing dramatic, but enough. Enough for those watching to recognize the shift. Enough for the perception in the room to pivot. A small smile flickered across a clerk's face as they passed by, eyes meeting Norman's briefly, acknowledging competence without words. Another patron whispered, "Look at how calm he is. That's the type who's seen this before." The quiet recognition spread. The subtle nods, the soft murmurs, the way people's attention sharpened, it all confirmed the change. Norman's gaze returned to Juana. He didn't mock. He didn't argue. He simply let the evidence, the alignment, and the silent network of subtle confirmations speak. The power imbalance that Juana had relied upon began to collapse, unspoken yet undeniable. If you've ever had to navigate authority in a public space, hit like. These lessons matter when no one else steps up. As the fluorescent lights flickered overhead, shadows danced lightly across the counter and the floor. Every reflection, every shimmer of metal on pens, medallions, and tablet edges, emphasized the quiet orchestration of the scene. Patrons leaned in, careful not to intrude, some recording, others just observing. Juana's composure cracked for the briefest moment. She adjusted her shoulders, glanced at a clerk, then back at Norman. The crowd noticed. The subtle tension hung in the air like a weight. And in that space, without a word, Norman had taken command, not through confrontation, but through preparation, observation, and faceless precision. A man near the door muttered, "He's not raising his voice. Yet she's losing control." Another whispered, "Record this. Don't blink." Norman shifted the folder slightly one last time, medallions catching the light, pen nudged perfectly in place. He exhaled quietly, controlled, unassuming. The room responded, not with applause, not with cheers, but with recognition. A subtle acknowledgement that competence and preparation could quietly reshape perception and balance in a tense public moment. Subscribe to see how this next step flips the room completely. Share if you've ever witnessed someone quietly stand their ground in public. The scene held for a breath-long pause, every micro-gesture, every subtle glance, every small knot of recognition layered like quiet dominoes about to fall. Norman's eyes swept the counter one final time, taking note of who had shifted attention, who had confirmed his quiet strategy. And just like that, the perception in the room had turned. Not because of heroics. Not because of volume or anger. But because of faceless, precise, deliberate strategy, seen by all, understood by few. Juana's hands froze above the corrected forms, and for the first time, the room realized her authority was unraveling in real time. Juana's confidence had been steady for almost an hour. Her voice had carried authority, sharp and precise, slicing through the hum of the Washington, D.C. service center. But now, it faltered. Her eyes scanned the forms in front of her, flipping one, then another, as corrections quietly spread across the counter. Each corrected instruction, each updated policy, chipped away at the foundation of control she had built. Norman Payne didn't move. His hands rested lightly over the tablet and folders in front of him. His breathing was calm, measured, his posture still and precise. He didn't need to speak. He didn't need to raise his voice. The room itself was changing around him, and every shift in attention, every subtle acknowledgement, was part of a larger story he had anticipated. A clerk quietly stepped forward to adjust a posted sign. Another leaned toward a printed instruction sheet and corrected a typo that had gone unnoticed for months. The adjustments were small, almost imperceptible to most, but together they formed a ripple, visible to those paying attention. Patrons leaned forward in their seats, murmurs spreading softly through the waiting room. Phones lifted, not for drama, but for documentation. If you've ever watched a system fail silently around someone, pause and comment, "You're part of this too." Norman's eyes swept the room. He noted the staff members who hesitated, the ones who had previously aligned with Juana's authority, and the subtle body language that revealed their shifting allegiance. Heads turned toward him briefly, recognizing his quiet composure without drawing attention. Every small gesture, correcting a form, adjusting a posted rule, offering a subtle nod of acknowledgement, added to the growing recognition that the system itself had weaknesses. Juana's lips parted, then closed again. She cleared her throat, attempting to reclaim control, but the energy of the room had already shifted. Patrons whispered softly, eyes flicking between her and Norman. A young man muttered, "She's losing it." A woman added, "Yeah. This is different." Not because Norman had spoken, but because the weight of competence and preparation spoke louder than words. Norman moved one folder slightly, aligning it perfectly with the tablet. His fingers hovered briefly over the pen, adjusting its position. The fluorescent lights above flickered softly, casting a rhythm of bright and dim across the counter. Every reflection glimmered off his medallions and the tablet's edges, drawing subtle attention to the careful orchestration at play. Patrons leaned in, some whispering, others lifting phones discreetly. The shift wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, deliberate, faceless, and effective. A clerk, Lindsay Hurst, nodded toward Norman and slid another corrected document across the counter. No words were spoken. The gesture was enough. The ripple began spreading farther. Other staff glanced at the forms, at the updated posted rules, then subtly adjusted their own workstations to reflect the corrections. What had started as a small crack in Juana's authority now expanded into a visible pattern of institutional awareness. Juana's hands hovered over the forms again, this time trembling slightly. Her confidence faltered in plain view of everyone. Norman's eyes noted every flicker of uncertainty, every micro-movement. He didn't react outwardly, didn't smile or frown. He simply observed, letting the facts speak. If you've ever seen someone quietly expose flaws in authority, hit like and share, these stories matter when no one intervenes. The murmurs from the waiting room grew. Patrons whispered to each other, sharing subtle observations. "Did you see how fast they corrected that?" one asked. "Yeah, that's crazy," replied another. Their voices were soft, careful, but carried weight. The perception in the room was no longer about drama, it was about competence, preparation, and the small but visible cracks in the system. Norman shifted a printed approval, aligning it with the tablet and folder. Every gesture was precise, deliberate, faceless. The room registered his calm authority without him saying a word. Even the subtle movement of his hands seemed to remind everyone watching that preparation, not volume, controlled the narrative. Juana attempted to speak again, her voice shaking, clipped. These forms. They're incorrect. Her words lacked conviction. Patrons noticed. Phones subtly tilted to capture her uncertainty. Staff glanced at each other, nodding imperceptibly, quietly correcting other small mistakes. The room's energy had changed. Recognition had shifted from Juana to the quiet, faceless strategy unfolding at the counter. Norman's eyes moved over every detail. He noted the spacing of patrons, the subtle angles of the cameras above, the reflections on the tablet and medallions. Every small adjustment mattered. Every corrected instruction reinforced the evidence that the system had vulnerabilities, and that he had anticipated them. One patron whispered, "He's not even raising his voice. And look at her." Another added, "Yeah. It's like she's unraveling." The murmurs spread like soft waves, building an unspoken consensus. The room was witnessing institutional correction in action, guided by the quiet precision of Norman's preparation. Small gestures multiplied. A clerk held a door slightly longer for a patron. Another offered a polite nod as someone walked past. The subtle micro-gestures, almost invisible to casual observers, reinforced the growing shift in perception. No heroics, no dramatics, just quiet acknowledgement of competence and preparation in action. Norman moved a pen slightly closer to the edge of the counter, aligning it parallel to the folder. The fluorescent lights overhead reflected off the metallic surface, highlighting the small but precise adjustments he had made. Patrons leaned in, subtle glances exchanged, the room collectively sensing a change. Juana's shoulders slumped slightly, her attempts to assert authority now muted. Norman remained calm, composed, faceless yet effective. The ripple effect of corrections, acknowledgments, and subtle gestures expanded outward. The staff had corrected mistakes, the posted rules now aligned with procedure, and the patrons had absorbed the change without spectacle. Subscribe to see how these quiet moves continue to shift the balance of authority. Share if you've ever witnessed someone subtly challenge a flawed system and succeed. Every small movement, folders shifted, medallions catching light, pens nudged, heads tilted, reinforced the unfolding story. The tension in the room had not dissipated, but it had transformed. What had been personal confrontation became systemic recognition, subtle yet undeniable. Norman's gaze swept the room one last time. Patrons, clerks, and staff alike had observed the quiet mastery of the situation. The ripple of institutional correction spread, unseen but deeply felt. Juana's faltering authority, the careful realignment of policies, and the silent acknowledgement from staff and patrons alike confirmed a new perception. Without a single raised voice, without a single shout, Norman had reshaped the scene. Not by spectacle, not by outrage, but by faceless precision, quiet preparation, and strategic observation. The system, once rigid and unyielding, had responded to competence. Patrons shuffled toward the exit, glancing at the posted rules and whispered corrections, as Norman quietly adjusted his folder and stepped aside. The room had settled. The sharp tension of the confrontation had softened into quiet observation. Patrons now moved slowly, pausing at the counters to glance at the updated signs and corrected instructions. Each small nod or murmured acknowledgement carried weight, a silent recognition that procedures mattered and that mistakes could be corrected without fanfare. Norman remained near the side corner, standing just far enough from the main counters to allow the activity to unfold without interference. His folder rested lightly in his hands, pages aligned, pen clipped neatly, and medallions from his community service catching the soft overhead fluorescent light. He didn't seek notice. He didn't demand gratitude. He simply observed. Clerks whispered among themselves, sharing quiet confirmations of the newly posted policy clarifications. One adjusted a laminated guide while another scanned the updated digital instructions, both careful to respect the procedural integrity Norman had demonstrated. If you've ever seen someone fix a system quietly, Think about who gets credit, and comment below. Patrons glanced at each other, sharing small smiles, subtle acknowledgements that the rules now made sense. A young man, holding his phone at his side, whispered, "Finally, someone did it right." His friend nodded, adjusting his backpack strap and checking the printed forms in his hand. The room's energy shifted, not toward applause, but toward understanding, a calm appreciation for order and fairness. Norman's eyes swept the room one more time. He noted the smallest details, a clerk gently holding open a door for a departing customer, a patron lifting a pen to initial a corrected form, another quietly stepping aside to allow a parent to pass with a stroller. Each micro move reinforced the idea that order could coexist with civility, that attentiveness mattered. Juana Vaughn had retreated slightly, folding her arms and glancing down at the forms still under her hands. Her posture reflected quiet resignation, the previous authority she had wielded so aggressively now felt fragile. She made no scene, offering no argument. The patrons and clerks were too engaged in the corrected processes to notice her attempts at composure. Norman didn't intervene. He didn't need to. The corrections, the public visibility of the policy, and the careful alignment of procedure were enough. The room now operated with subtle improvements, clarity in instructions, attention to posted rules, and a quiet reinforcement of proper conduct. If you've ever observed a small victory that ripples beyond its immediate moment, hit like and share, it's how change spreads. Some patrons lingered, reading updated notices on the walls, comparing them to their own forms. Others whispered confirmations to friends or family. The murmurs were low, respectful, reflective. They weren't gossiping, they were processing the subtle lessons Norman had left behind. He had acted without spectacle, but the impact was clear, systemic improvement without theatrics. A clerk handed a printed copy of corrected policy to a customer, her fingers brushing lightly against the stack. She offered a nod, quiet and professional. The customer returned it with a small smile, scanning the corrections and muttering a soft, "Makes sense." These small acknowledgments, almost imperceptible, carried more weight than any dramatic declaration. Norman observed without judgment. He did not seek applause or recognition. Each subtle action in the room, the careful handoffs, the attentive glances, the whispered confirmations, was a reflection of what happens when systems function as they should, and when those who understand them act calmly and strategically. The room's energy had shifted from conflict to reflection. Patrons who had initially been anxious or tense now moved with measured attention, noting small details, reading instructions fully, and following guidance with care. A mother helped her child with a form, her hand steady as she mimicked the micro-movements she had observed. Norman noticed the replication of his methodical approach, not imposed, not enforced, but absorbed. Juana adjusted her posture again, this time stepping back further. Her previous confidence had waned. She glanced at the clerks and the patrons, recognizing that her authority no longer commanded the room. Yet no humiliation was necessary, the truth of the policy had been revealed calmly, leaving her to absorb the consequence in silence. Norman picked up a pen, tapping lightly against the folder as he reviewed the final page. His movements were precise, intentional, faceless. He didn't glance at anyone, he didn't invite attention. Yet the room's attention naturally followed him, reading in his quiet preparation the power of diligence and knowledge over bluster and assumption. If you're watching quietly, consider how small, deliberate actions can ripple through a system. Share this story so others notice the value of preparation and observation. Patrons continued their movements, leaving the counter in orderly fashion, carrying with them a subtle awareness of policy, procedure, and the small victories they had just witnessed. A clerk adjusted a digital display, aligning it with corrected instructions. Another whispered softly, confirming the dates and approval numbers Norman had highlighted. The hum of fluorescent lights, the soft shuffle of shoes, the low murmur of conversation, all created a quiet symphony of procedural progress. There was no fanfare, no applause, only the gentle acknowledgement that systems could function better when approached with calm intelligence. Norman observed a young man scanning his folder, a small nod passing between them, not of recognition, but of shared understanding. The significance of the moment was not in spectacle but in the quiet adherence to principle. The patron's awareness, the clerk's subtle corrections, and the restored clarity of the posted instructions created a ripple of institutional improvement. As the last few patrons exited, Norman closed the folder, aligning it with the edge of the counter. He didn't look up. He didn't announce victory. He simply stepped aside, allowing the room to continue functioning under the newly clarified policies. His presence remained incidental, yet the lessons embedded in the day's events lingered. The quiet dignity of the patrons, the attentive micro-movements of the clerks, and the calm composure of Norman created a tableau of subtle systemic change. It was a reminder that influence doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it exists in preparation, observation, and faceless execution. Comment below if you've ever noticed quiet competence changing a room. You might inspire someone else to act with strategy and care. Norman turned slightly, checking one final digital display, and stepped toward the exit, folder in hand. The room had been altered, not by spectacle, not by heroism, but by meticulous attention to rules, careful observation, and silent influence. Patrons carried the experience with them, clerks integrated the corrections, and a small but enduring improvement in systemic function had been realized. In the hushed aftermath, the lesson was clear: respect for procedure, attention to detail, and calm strategic action could ripple outward quietly, shaping perception and practice far beyond any individual confrontation. Norman didn't need recognition. The system, the patrons, and the clerks would carry the impact forward, subtle but lasting. Everything finally went still. The fluorescent lights hummed low, almost like the room itself was exhaling after holding its breath for hours. Patrons shuffled slowly toward the exit, murmuring quietly among themselves, but the storm of confrontation that had defined the day had faded into a calm tension. Norman stood near the counter, hands folded over his folder, posture relaxed yet precise, absorbing the subtle shift in the space. Every chair that creaked under shifting weight, every footstep down the linoleum, marked the slow return of order, but it was not quite the same order as before. Something had changed. Norman didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel heroic. He had learned something far quieter, far heavier, and far more enduring. He had become a witness to systemic truth, not a lone actor against injustice. Not about others, but about the mechanics of authority itself. He understood now that patience, attention, and observation, what the world often dismissed as quiet compliance, could move people and systems more effectively than anger or spectacle ever could. The medallions pinned to his lanyard caught the last flickers of light, glinting softly, silent markers of a life spent learning the ways of micro-moments, policy, and subtle leverage. Each small accomplishment from the day, the corrected forms, the subtle nods of approval from staff, the whispers of recognition from patrons, spoke to his method. He realized that influence rarely needed applause. Sometimes, it needed only presence, awareness, and the discipline to wait for the right moment. He took a slow breath, letting the tension dissolve in a rhythm he had cultivated over years. It didn't erase the struggle, didn't undo the humiliation Juana had tried to inflict, but it carried a different weight, a quiet satisfaction that the system, however imperfect, had responded to reason, evidence, and patience. Norman adjusted his folder again, placing it neatly atop the counter, eyes sweeping the room one last time. Observers lingered, scanning posted rules, checking procedure numbers, quietly shifting their own behaviors in ways that would ripple beyond the day's confrontation. Patrons left not in fear, but with awareness. Clerks and staff returned to their duties with subtler respect for the rules and for those who followed them. The lesson had landed, not through heroism, but through unassuming competence. Norman felt the soft pressure of relief settle across his shoulders. He didn't need applause, yet the room carried a weight of acknowledgement that was far more enduring than cheers. Some systems are slow. Some authorities falter. Some rules exist to protect, and others are misused to shame. Yet, Norman's day had quietly proven something larger, that persistence, accuracy, and calm observation can ripple through institutions, teaching without spectacle, correcting without confrontation, and nudging fairness into spaces where it often goes unnoticed. The city itself hummed in low undertones, and the lesson extended beyond the center walls. Patrons would remember, staff would adjust, and the policies, subtle, documented, and now corrected, would silently carry forward the evidence that the day's small victories had been earned, not begged for. It was the quiet work of systemic improvement, unglorified and faceless, yet far more potent than any singular act of drama. Norman stepped back from the counter, hands folded again over his folder, and let his gaze sweep the room one final time. The late afternoon sun sliced through the blinds, casting narrow bars of light across the tiles. Shadows lengthened along the walls, stretching toward the corners where forgotten folders and signs of yesterday's chaos now rested undisturbed. He walked toward the exit, slow, deliberate, and unhurried, each step leaving space for the ripple of change to spread. Patrons passed him, some pausing for a nod, some unaware of the quiet history they had just witnessed. Juana remained behind, stationary, her authority subtly diminished, her posture betraying the unspoken lesson of procedural accountability. And just as Norman reached the doorway, the golden light caught a folder sitting apart from the others, slightly ajar, with a seal he didn't recognize. He stopped. He glanced at it. For the first time that afternoon, a shadow of uncertainty crossed the space. The room seemed to hold its breath again, as if sensing that the story was not finished. Subscribe to our community and channel, turn on your notification bell, there's more waiting behind and you won't believe what is revealed next. Some ripples don't end at the counter. They travel. They deepen. And the next moment, they bring new discoveries, that might just change everything. Stay close, the next phase will shift everything you thought you knew about that day. Dot. Dot.